Greetings from Tokyo, my dear friends. This is Daisuke, and I very much hope that this video finds you well and in very good spirits wherever you are in the world. And today, if you don't mind, I would very much like to continue on with our journeys, our discussions, our discoveries, and our explorations with respect to the recent releases made by the Criterion Collection during this year of 2022. That brings us to a film which can be found within this release, this set release, which was made by Criterion earlier this year. And this set release is given the spine number of 1159, this being the Infernal Affairs trilogy. And within this set, which is called the Infernal Affairs trilogy, there is the film, which is described as being from the year 2002. And the names of the filmmakers are Andrew Lau, Wai-keung, and Alan Mak. And the name of the film is, let me open it up here to show the disc, which is right here. Infernal Affairs. This is the work which is described as being from the year 2002, and it is from the directors Andrew Lau, Wai-keung, and Alan Mak, and it is a screenplay which is credited to Alan Mak and Felix Chong Mang-keung, and it has in its remarkable cast people like Andrew Lau Takwa, and Tony Leung Chu Wai, and others. For example, Anthony Wong Chao Sang, and others. It's a remarkable, iconic work, which is, and again, please pardon me for my very poor pronunciation. I hope you can forgive me, but it is called Mo Gando, or as it's referred to in English, Infernal Affairs. And I hear there's a siren in the background as I'm filming this, and that might be apropos because this is, of course, a film which is about police, or to be perfectly, maybe to be even more direct, it is about a story that involves police and detective work, undercover work, and also the dangers of undercover work in terms of being found out in terms of moles and informants, but also the psychological depths that are being explored and the effects on the psychologies and also the effects on the soul and the spiritual. That is also on display here, I think, in great helpings that are both grand and epic, and also very intimate and personal, deeply personal. And I think that's one of the great hallmarks and trademarks of the success of this incredible work, which is Infernal Affairs. Now, I mentioned the police, but as we know, as we try to explore the plot of this work, Infernal Affairs, that is only one side of the equation, because we are also dealing with the criminal side, the underworld, and organized crime, and specifically too, we have the parallelism or the construct of this story is very clever and very genius. We have the police side and the criminal underworld side, and on each of these sides respectively, we have one person infiltrating the other side in the form of an informant or mole. So, for example, the underworld has a mole within the police force, and the police force in turn has its own mole or informant in the underworld side. So we have the cross-section or the crossover of these two separate sides of the law, and it's a brilliant construct. It's a very genius construct. Within this, of course, we have the cross-section of the characters portrayed by Andy Lau and Tony Leung, and they form this duo, this sort of duo that is linked in terms of the plot construct, because one of the areas of suspense and drama and thriller aspect of this film are will they be found out, and will the course of the plot as it goes from the investigation into trying to bring down this very high level figure within the criminal underworld, Hong Sam, and whether this will somehow threaten the positions of the moles respectively. I'm speaking of both sides. And there lies the inherent tension or suspense of the film, as well as the intrigue too. Now, the intrigue comes from the plot intricacies. Now, the way in which the plot unravels is so clever and so dynamic. There are subplots within subplots within subplots. And each of these subplots gives rise to the possibility and the risk of one person being found out. And that leads also to the potential chain reaction of events that makes this plot oh so clever, oh so intriguing, and oh so rewatchable. And a very, very engaging treat indeed. And I mentioned the cleverness of it as well. I mean, there's ways in which there's a type of mirror imaging going on that also is reflective not just in the thematic and character constructs, and we'll talk about that a little bit later, but also specifically in the plot. When things happen on one side, there is a type of resonance or cause and effect relationship that affects the other side, and then vice versa, and vice versa, and vice versa. It becomes a type of house of cards that runs a risk of tumbling at any moment or falling at any moment or crumbling. And that crumble is part of the, I think, not just appeal and entertainment value, but also the way in which we as viewers are drawn in immediately. Will one side be found out over the other? And two, this way in which this film divides the mirror imaging or the mirror, say, characterization. Both sides of the law, or each side of the law, is being represented in this crisscross type of way. This also makes for very interesting ambiguity in character development and exploration, because we have quote unquote good characters, our heroes, doing very questionable acts, and then on the other side of the coin, our villains also doing acts that might be said to be perhaps even heroic. And so that cross section or cross divide also makes, I think, for really interesting and engaging discussions of nuance and ambiguity and morality. And that aspect of morality too, and the psychological effects in terms of moral actions or immoral actions, or the risk of immoral action, that also is on display in various scenes involving, say, a psychological maybe evaluations, and also very intimate personal details that are revealed of each of the characters. That shows, I think, a real depth and willingness of this film to go into these moments of real, I think, character development that make for very emotionally and dramatic viewing, but also make the film even more resonant, because the more we get to know these characters, the more we are either rooting for them or maybe hoping for them to succeed or not wanting them to get caught, etc., etc. So this room for character development and exploration of the psychological profiles of these characters in this way that could be said to be very intimate, very calm, very serene, very quiet, is also a wonderful not just a wonderful way to explore the characters, it's not just a wonderful way to further the plot, but also I think it also adds a sense of balance, because it gives rise to a sense of moments that we can breathe and we can relax and get to know these characters, while also getting ready for, say, the next showdown or the next possible connection or interaction or risk of being found out, etc. So the balancing act here is really quite wonderful. And indeed, we have balancing acts galore, not just in terms of the way in which this film is able to switch on and off, but also the way in which we have balancing acts between essentially two sets of stories that are combined or intertwined, again, representing each side of the law respectively. So it's a fascinating construct in that way. And then we have also to the way in which this is shot. There's a type of sheen and look to this film. The way that rooftops are shot. I mean, this cover art for the box set, I think, is showing a very iconic image of how rooftops are shot, how things are out in the open. Secrets are open secrets in a manner of speaking, yet things are so well hidden in plain view. And I think that can be as a type of metaphor for a lot of things, as well as to, we have to remember that this film, I think, carries with it a certain sense of significance and historical weight and consequence, because and this is, I think, going to be explored in a number of the supplements that we will talk about a little bit later in this video, in the context of Infernal Affairs, and also in the context of the Infernal Affairs trilogy overall. The way in which this film figures in, or prefigures or postfigures, the way in which Hong Kong characterizes itself and sees itself, and thus how the people of Hong Kong, including the characters within the world of Infernal Affairs and the films beyond, how they see themselves and others around them in the context of 1997 and indeed a post-1997 world. So this becomes, I think, another fascinating level upon level upon level that we see on display here in Infernal Affairs. The way that this is constructed is quite amazing. Again, I mentioned Andrew Lau and Alan Mak, the directors, and Felix Chung and Alan Mak as being the screenwriters. I also mentioned too this idea of levels. This is also a really important construct. This idea of not just the levels of sort of conspiracy and duplicity that is reflected in the plot, not just the levels of, say, characters being and their hidden agendas hiding further hidden agendas. So level upon level of, say, character depth and development. It's not those levels are there, but it's not just those levels, and also not just the historical context of this film as a sort of police thriller entertainment, then also with the level of the historical significance of a post-1997 Hong Kong world. We have those levels as well, but it's not just that as well. We have this idea of the spiritual and the philosophical, the levels of a type of, as reflected in a Buddhist philosophy that is reflected from the very start of this work, and it's reflected, I would say, throughout the construct of the film, and indeed perhaps beyond when we talk about, say, the other films in this trilogy. But when we're speaking about Infernal Affairs, it's there right in the open, and it's there from the very start. This idea of levels, and also this idea of a type of maybe a religious or philosophical aspect, and this idea of a morality, a universal type of morality and suffering, and how this is also sourced within a personal, deep emotional suffering and trauma and angst that we see very much embedded within the characters that we meet, specifically our main characters, but within, say, all the characters that we meet. This idea of suffering and angst and concern, that is also maybe the suggestion to that this also is linked to a sort of religious or philosophical view of suffering and hell and morality. And so this type of levels are these this way in which the construct of religious or religion or philosophy is embedded within the levels of the film Infernal Affairs. This is also a genius move. This is so genius because it then comes back full circle into the way in which this type of view, a religious or philosophical view, can be said to be an outlook as to how we as viewers of this film regard these characters in this world. It is a genius move. And so this is, I think, another aspect of how this film, Infernal Affairs, really operates so well. It's such an intriguing premise that is carried through with a grand design that is genius, that is intricate, that is so delicate and nuanced. It never lets go. It's well balanced. It's thrilling. It's shocking in places. It goes in twists and turns that for the first time viewer, you're in for one heck of a ride. And indeed, it has so much compelling aspects that really draws one in even after the initial view upon rewatch and rewatch and rewatch and rewatch again. I should point out that when I first caught up with this film, many years ago, as sort of a video rental or a DVD rental when I was living in the States at the time. It was so captivating. I remember watching this film on repeat. It was that captivating and it was that compelling. And now watching it in the context of this new Criterion Collection release, I am reminded of those days of being oh so compelled and oh so caught up with the swirl and the hypnotic atmosphere and the rugged almost brutality of the film, the brutal realism of the film in a manner of speaking, that I'm once again all set to go for this ride for many years to come. This is, of course, the film which is, again, described as being from the year 2002. As part of this set, the Infernal Affairs trilogy, it is this film which is Infernal Affairs. The Criterion Collection has released this film, Infernal Affairs, under this new Blu-ray set, or as part of this new Blu-ray set. And as I mentioned, the set itself comprehensively is known as the Infernal Affairs trilogy. And one of the discs, as we can see right here, one of the discs is, it's in this 3-disc Blu-ray set. And one of the discs, of course, here being this one, which is the Infernal Affairs disc, which is the first one which I have on this side here for purposes of the display of this video discussion. But with regard to the presentations, let me now refer to the booklet, and I've taken the liberty of removing the booklet prior to the start of this video recording. And it says on page, it's a staple booklet too, and I'm very thrilled about that. We'll talk about that a little bit later, but for purposes of the discussion about the restorations, it says on page 30, Infernal Affairs, Infernal Affairs 2, and Infernal Affairs 3 are presented in their original aspect ratio of 2.35 to 1. And these 4K digital restorations were undertaken by Media Asia from the 35mm original camera negatives at l'Immagine Ritrovata's facilities in Bologna, Italy, and Hong Kong. The original 5.1 surround soundtracks were remastered from the digital audio master files. A transfer supervision, l'Immagine Ritrovata Asia and Hong Kong. And so this is a very, I think, interesting and intriguing premise. Of course, these 4K digital restorations, which are in effect kind of new ways of presenting this and the other films in the Infernal Affairs trilogy, Infernal Affairs. I should point out that I have never seen Infernal Affairs in the theater, and so I've never had that great fortune in my life to have been able to do so, unfortunately. But I have seen it on a number of home media releases. I mentioned rentals many, many years ago. And also I mentioned, let me mention here, I also have it on, for instance, this Tartan Asia Extreme DVD set. And this is the DVD set which has the 3 films on their own DVD discs, and one of which, of course, is being Infernal Affairs. So I have the experience of watching it on home media. And then when based on that very limited subjective experience of mine, I was entering into this world of this Criterion release and the 4K restoration, and to see how I'd feel about it. Now, I think in general, I would say that this work, Infernal Affairs, to me and to my eyes, I think there's a sense in which this film has a type of sheen to it. And my understanding and my experience with the film has always been with a sense of excitement, and that sheen, an almost type of, and I mean this in a very complimentary way, almost a type of video screen sheen to the film that adds an extra level of almost neon cool. I don't know if that makes any sense, but there is a way in which that has a type of sweep to it, especially when we have daytime scenes which are very bright and very sunshiny and clear-skied. And there are many of those scenes in this film, contrasted with a number of the scenes that are taking place in shadowed interior rooms and sort of dark hallways and things that might be embedded in a type of darkness or shadow. And so there's a type of contrast that comes about, when I watch this film in those video presentations or those earlier, those presentations from previous years. And so I think for my eyes, I feel like this 4K digital restoration does, in an interesting way, preserve that sense of the video screen sheen. It doesn't feel like a quote-unquote perfect restoration. When we hear about restorations of other releases of other films, we oftentimes hear about the way in which things seem clearer and crisper and the like. And while those aspects, I would say, are there in my experience with this 4K restoration of Infernal Affairs as presented by the Criterion Collection, those aspects are there, and there are scenes that really pop out in that way. The delineation and the clarity is really quite striking, and I'm very, very impressed with that overall. I'm very impressed with this overall. But I would say, too, that there is also a lingering air of the sort of video, almost a video sheen edge to the film, and there's a sense of a type of, I don't want to say blurriness in a way, but there's a way in which certain movements, especially I noticed to my eyes, movement of camera that occurs in scenes involving, say, shadowed interiors. There's a sense in which the movement has a type of almost a slight, almost nuanced digital feel to it, and I think that might be seen by others as a type of maybe point of criticism. And if you feel that way, I think that's very, very valid, very legitimate. And I do acknowledge that to my inexperienced eyes, I do notice that from time to time. But I don't mind that at all because, as I say, for me and my own subjective experience with the film, I've experienced it in this type of video screen sheen, not throughout the entirety of the film, but through certain key scenes. And so I think I've come to, and I take that, I mean that very, very complimentarily. I mean that as a positive note, because as I say, I think it has that sense of a post 1997 world. And I think it also gives it a sense of a Hong Kong film. And also, I would say too that the supplements, when we get to some of the discussions with the directors, Andrew Lau and Alan Mak, they do mention too some of the aesthetic qualities that they were looking for. I think they were looking at a type of quote unquote reality and a sheen to it that would suggest a sense of reality, almost in a way, a type of low budget affair. And I think what they mean by that is the way in which there isn't a sense of the overly cinematically grandiose in the shots, but rather there is a sense of the way in which this film does cover the ground. It covers the dirty, grungy hallways and the meeting places and the warehouses and those corners of the warehouse, etc., as well as the hallways in the movie theaters or things of that nature. And also, I think, is very suggestive of trying to capture a sense of quote unquote the reality. And I think that type of aesthetic is very consistent with what one might call a sort of video screen sheen in terms of how I viewed the film before and how I still view the film even in the context of this 4K digital restoration as part of the Criterion presentation. I would dare say, too, that this comment that I've just made, I think, is apropos in terms of my experiences with the other films, and I'll get to that when we talk about the other films in this trilogy. But I think that's the case for me with this Infernal Affairs presentation. So all in all, I'm very pleased with it. And I think it serves very well in my eyes in terms not just of how I view the film, but also how I see the thematic concerns, I think, reflected in a very intriguing, interesting way with this presentation. And now let us speak about the supplements that can be found with respect to this particular disc that has, as we know, the film Infernal Affairs. So as I mentioned before, this set has 3 discs total, the films being separated on each of these 3 discs. And one such disc, therefore, is devoted to Infernal Affairs. Now, in that same disc, we also have supplements that can be found in the supplemental features submenu, as well as another supplement, which we'll talk about momentarily. That could be said to be linked primarily to this work, Infernal Affairs. So what are those supplements that can be found on this first Blu-ray disc as part of this set? Well, first off, we have the commentary track, which is an audio option. Again, like many other commentary tracks that can be found in Criterion and elsewhere, it is a great thing to have. This is a commentary track that's described as being or featuring Andrew Lau, Wai-keung, and Alan Mak, and Felix Chung Man-keung in the submenu that's described in this commentary track. So Andrew Lau and Alan Mak being the directors, and then Felix Chung and Alan Mak being the credit to the screenplay or the writing of the work. However, I should point out that I should point out a number of things. First off, this is a commentary track which I know has been made available through other releases that I've mentioned before. So it's always good to have commentary tracks. Even if they're already existing elsewhere, it's always great to have it, especially this commentary track, because I think in general it goes through a lot of these the character beats, which I really like. It goes through a lot of the explanations as to or interpretations as to why characters are performing things the way they are on the film, or maybe some indications or guesswork or other, say, maybe assumptions about the backgrounds of the characters. Which, again, this is reflecting the fact that this work, Infernal Affairs, is very much a psychological drama. It's very much a psychological drama. It has its action moments, that's for sure. And this is, I think, referred to in another supplement, which we'll get to momentarily. It's a very interesting concept about how this could be seen or marketed as a type of action film. But in fact, I think it is also regarded as a very deep and very contemplative psychological drama. And I think that is reflected in how the participants in the commentary track I think, are focusing a lot on the character beats, the thematic moments, the why characters are doing what they are doing. And that also is reflecting in sort of a way in which the characters were written and conceived, as well as also performance choices. So it's all in all, it's a really great commentary track to have, and I'm glad that Criterion was able to bring it back, or to bring it here for purposes of this of their release. Now, I should point out, however, just a number of things. So, actually, it's my understanding that there are other participants in the commentary tracks, in this commentary track, other than the three that have been mentioned here or in the Criterion submenu. And so my understanding, for instance, is that I think some of the actors and some of the performers are involved as well, and you can tell this by the comments that are being made. I should point out that this commentary track is given in, I understand, the Cantonese language, and so when you hear the commentary track, for those like myself, I cannot understand. I'm not fluent in the language, unfortunately, so I have to rely on the English subtitles. Unfortunately, the subtitles, my understanding is, do not provide also reference as to who exactly is speaking at the point that the commentary track is going on. So it's not clear to me all the time who is making the comment. And so that, I think it would have been very helpful for me if that additional detail could have been added to the commentary track subtitles. That would have been very, very helpful indeed. But it's still possible to understand who is speaking by, for example, hearing the comments themselves and hearing the context of the comments. I think one can generally make out who might be speaking. Now, this also brings me to another point, which is the commentary track, actually, my understanding is, features not just these three filmmakers, Andrew Lau, Alan Mak, and Felix Chung, but also the commentary track features actors as well. And so you can tell this because you get comments that are referring to certain performances that we see on screen as these comments, the commentary track comments are ongoing. And we actually hear details about performance choices, about how this actor met someone on set, or certain inspirational choices, etc. So this is very much, these are comments that seem to be made by actor participants in this film. And so I think that's what we're getting with this commentary track. And again, it's not exactly clear because we're not receiving the benefit in the subtitles of hearing, or I'm sorry, we're not receiving the benefit in the subtitles of seeing the translation, who exactly is speaking at a given point in time in a commentary track. So I think had that been included, I think that would have been great. That would have been just phenomenal. As it happens, of course, one can get the context as one is hearing the commentary track and watching the film at the same time to get a sense of who might be speaking at what given point. So I don't think it's a terrible commentary. On the contrary, I think it's a great one for the reasons that I've mentioned previously. But it would have been, I think, given that additional extra edge with the that added benefit of the subtitling. But oh well, that's still okay, because as I say, one can still get a very clear sense of who is making the comments as we hear this commentary track. So I'm glad it's included for purposes of the Criterion Collection release. And then continuing on, we can talk about the supplements, which are found with this Blu-ray Disc 1, which has Infernal Affairs. So when you go to the supplements submenu, we have a number of things. First up, we have what's described as the alternate ending. And the alternate ending described as being for the mainland China release. Now, this is totaling 19 minutes, approximately. And it starts from a particular scene. I don't want to get into too much detail for anyone who hasn't seen the film yet, but it starts in a particular scene somewhat late in the film, and it carries on through to the ending, and that ending, which is an alternate ending, which is an ending that is different, as that phrase suggests. It is different from the ending that you see on the release version that is part of the main attraction of this Blu-ray disc. So This is approximately 19 minutes. It's a very fascinating turn of events, let me put it that way. It's not just, I think, for the sake of curiosity, although it's that as well, but also it has some really interesting, deep ramifications as to how the story would evolve and move forward beyond the frames of the film, in a manner of speaking. So very fascinating stuff indeed. I should point out that this alternate ending, I think, has been made as a feature elsewhere. For instance, I've mentioned, for example, my experience with a previous DVD release prior to this Criterion Blu-ray, and it does have the alternate ending as part of this DVD supplements. However, I think this DVD supplement had the ending, it was shorter. It was, I think, approximately 9 or 10 minutes here. So we're getting a longer uh, way of watching or experiencing the ending with this Criterion release. Is one better than the other? I'm not sure. Maybe the benefit of having a little bit more time in this particular supplement might give a better sense to the viewer, such as myself, getting back into the flow and the rhythm of the film, in a manner of speaking. So perhaps a little bit longer could be considered to be better. But in any event, it is something that you could get a sense of in previous releases. But it's also nice to have it as part of the Criterion release here. So that's the first thing that's here. So just in case you're interested. And the next up in the supplements, we have a brilliant conversation, a one-on-one conversation between Andrew Lau, Wai-keung, and Alan Mak. And this was described as being from 2022. And so this is, I understand, a new supplement, a Criterion-produced supplement. We have the two of them, these two artists, collaborators, filmmakers, so key, so central in the way in which they discuss their positions in Hong Kong cinema during this time, and also the way in which their collaboration emerged, what their roles are, and what they were seeking, and what their hopes were when they were trying to put together this film, Infernal Affairs. So this is fantastic. This discussion with the two of them is approximately 38 minutes, and my goodness, it is great. This is really, really great. It focuses, I would say, primarily on infernal affairs. I think there is very, very little, if any, mention of, say, any of the other films in the trilogy. So it is primarily, I would say, Infernal Affairs or Infernal Affairs 1 based. But that's not all that they talk about here. They also talk about the two of them. They talk about their upbringings, their biographies, their growing up, experiencing cinema growing up. They mention, for instance, their own backgrounds, and they have similar yet different details in their backgrounds. I think one of the points of similarities is how each of them, Andrew Lau and Alan Mak respectively, experienced cinema from an early age. And also Alan Mak, in that conversation about growing up, he also talks about how he came from a police family or background, which I think is important because it gives him that sense, or it explains also from his perspective, as he puts it. It's his way of also explaining how he, I think, has a real great sense and handle over a story like Infernal Affairs, and indeed that's why he was able to conjure up this particular story in this way. It's also a point that's referred to, I think, in the commentary track at some points, I should say. They also talk about, again, turning our attention to a little bit of the genesis of the film, or the lead up to the genesis of this film. They also talk about a Hong Kong cinema industry and their positions and their growing careers throughout this situation into the 90s, and also meeting other key collaborators like Felix Chung and others. And also they too speak about certain influences, contemporary influences. The filmmaker John Woo comes up, and they speak, for instance, about John Woo's going to Hollywood and making Hollywood cinema. And films like Broken Arrow are mentioned. Also Face Off is mentioned. I think Face Off is cited in particular as being a really fascinating way in which cinema can operate in this real John Woo aesthetic. It's so, the suspension of disbelief aspect of Face Off is really quite incredible. I mean, just a side note here, I saw Face Off in the theater when it was released. I thought it was incredible. I still do. It's so much fun. It's so wild and inventive, and it's so John Woo. It has that great John Woo aesthetic, and I think that's how Andrew Lau and Alan Mak in particular describe it that way in this laudatory terms. So Uh, and then, of course, they speak too about their own production dreams and ambitions and their own production company aspects, or Andrew Lau in particular, and how he wanted to have a sense of sort of production independence and trying to find some kind of subject matter or debut feature. And so that's how I think the collaboration between the two of them came about for purposes of Infernal Affairs. Now, they then go into a discussion about the film itself, this idea of precision, and it's not a typical action film as they describe it. You know, there are action set pieces, of course, but there is this idea of, and the sort of story point of the undercover cop is one that has existed, they acknowledge, in films leading up to Infernal Affairs in Hong Kong cinema. But they describe it in a number of, two, I think, fundamental details emerge here. First is they say that they have introduced here the element of the mole within the police force. And so this is, as they acknowledge, a kind of new element. And I think this adds a beautiful, precise mirror image or parallel imagery that creates this intricate design, this grand design of the film, which is brilliant, absolutely brilliant. So that's one point. And another point too is, as we've alluded to earlier, this is not, this, one could say that this isn't necessarily a quote unquote action heavy film. There are some pretty intense action set pieces, don't get me wrong, but, and the filmmakers here acknowledge this as well, I think they were trying to create, in their eyes, this was a psychological drama, and they were actually, they describe it as maybe they're getting some pressure at some point from the studio or from the finance backers saying, you know, maybe you should add some more action scenes here. But they bring that anecdote up as a point to make that, in their eyes, this film is a psychological drama. And I really find that very, very fascinating indeed, you know, that perspective. And then, you know, when I speak of investors, you know, Media Asia. And then, of course, there's this idea of trying to create this film that is precise and has reliance on details. And also, Andrew Lau mentions the lighting, the aesthetic. This is, I think, what we were referring to earlier when we were talking about the presentation style. And here he mentions he's a believer in quote-unquote simple lighting. And so I think what he means by this is this idea of trying to capture a sense of a directness. And that directness does not always have to rely on very elaborately staged photographic setups. I mean, there's nothing wrong with elaborately staged photographic setups. I mean, that's one of the great beauties of cinema and some of the great examples of cinema that we've seen throughout the history of cinema. But I think Andrew Lau's commentary is really, really quite compelling, and it goes towards this idea of the aesthetic and mood and atmosphere that maybe the filmmakers were trying to capture. And indeed, it's very, very evident in a positive and very effective way when you watch a film like Infernal Affairs. There's also mentioning here of Christopher Doyle, very interesting detail. Also this idea of the editing process, and also to the opening sequence. I mentioned the opening sequence as a way in which we can derive the sense of the levels of suffering, or the religious or philosophical approach that this film also espouses. So very, very important detail as well. Also, to the significance of the title, Infernal Affairs, and sort of the evolution or history of the title, and when this film could have been titled versus what this film ended up being entitled. So that's very interesting as well. And then also they speak too about the film that was directed by Martin Scorsese, which is called The Departed. And the Martin Scorsese film is often regarded as being, in many ways, a type of remake of this film, Infernal Affairs. And so they acknowledge in that discussion that the way in which there's a sense of how they feel about that particular film and the type of attention that the film then received, I think, upon occasion of that film, The Departed. But of course, on the initial release of Infernal Affairs, they do mention how this was a big success, critical and financial, and they do mention too as a type of almost means to resuscitate the Hong Kong cinema industry, financially speaking. So it really came to the rescue in a lot of ways. So this is in many ways an important, iconic cinematic achievement in the context of Hong Kong cinema and the context of cinema overall, you know, the 2000s and beyond. And so this is a brilliant, brilliant discussion between the two of them. And also, I mentioned a little bit too about maybe primarily they don't speak about the other films, although they do mention a little bit about Infernal Affairs 2. And maybe we'll talk about Infernal Affairs 2 in a separate video. But all in all, this is a fantastic, fantastic discussion. Please check it out if you can. This is approximately 38 minutes. But that's not all, because then we get a supplement which is described as being from 2007, and this is Hong Kong Noir. It's given the title in the supplement section, Hong Kong Noir, although I think in the actual supplement, the title, when you play it, I think it's referred to as Hong Kong Film Noir. But this is by Yves Montmeyer, approximately 23 minutes, and it features, among other people, Felix Chong, Wai-keung, and Alan Mak. And so Felix Chong, recall, is one of the credited screenwriters of the film, and so the collaboration with Felix Chong is referred to in, say, the commentary track, and also in that previous discussion between the two filmmakers, the Criterion supplement, approximately 38-minute one. But now we have Felix Chong featured, and we see him, and we hear his voice, and again, we heard his voice before, but now we hear and see him. And he's talking here about a number of things, about the draft and the time that he had in order to prepare the draft. It also coincided with his wedding, which is a very interesting personal detail. He didn't have that much time for the benefit of writing or his rewrite or his addressing the story for Infernal Affairs, although he acknowledges that he had a little bit more time, relatively speaking, when he was tasked with approaching part 2, and then a little bit more time as well with respect to part 3. And also some of the other comments here from Alan Mak and Peter Tsai, Hong Kong International Film Festival director, and others. They speak about the state of Hong Kong cinema, Hong Kong film, type of formula as they describe it from the 80s and 90s, and how you had very sophisticated audiences leading up to the release of a film like Infernal Affairs. And so I think the filmmakers knew, and they acknowledge it in this documentary, that they couldn't take anything for granted and story-wise, and so they had to find new, fresh, and innovative ways in order to create something that was enticing and that was exciting, and that would be a draw. It would be a theater draw. People would want to go see in the theater. This was this idea of the sophisticated audiences and what they would be expecting. And so this is, I think, a real key point, because when you watch a film like Infernal Affairs, and indeed the other two films, Infernal Affairs 2 and Infernal Affairs 3, which again we'll talk about in more detail in separate videos, I think it's safe to say that no matter how one views these films, it's still safe to say that I think everyone, or certainly almost everyone, would consider that these films are very, very sophisticated in terms of plot construction, intricacy, and also the way in which things are balanced and tightened out in a way that is feels very imaginative and very fresh. So this is wonderful stuff indeed. And also we have comments from others like Alan Mak, talking about his background, again, from what he describes as a police family, and also the funding limitations he mentions a little bit. Also, too, he mentions a comment that we heard in the previous Criterion produced supplement about a simple lighting, as they mentioned earlier. Here, Alan Mak mentions this idea of natural light as well, and so that also has maybe it's a reflection of the financial limitations of certain budgets, certain shoots. It's also, I think, an interesting visual aesthetic choice that I think the point here could be made that it could be said to be a reflection of a type of feeling of post 1997 and post handover, and the idea of a certain sense of lifestyle that had been part of this area leading up to 1997 had maybe undergone a sense of change, maybe gradual in some instances, or maybe immediate in others, such that this post-change feeling or atmosphere could be said to be reflected in this quote-unquote, say, simple light or natural light aesthetic that I think Alan Mak and Andrew Law are speaking about here in other supplements. I think there's a very fascinating way in which one can link the visual aesthetic with the various socio-political concerns that one can read into a film like Infernal Affairs. Very fascinating indeed. And also the idea, too, of identity crisis. This film is very much about identity crises And one can say, too, that the sense of identity crises is also intertwined in the socio-political construct and significance of Hong Kong pre and post 1997. So very fascinating stuff indeed. So it's great to have this 2007, it's described as being 2007, or mid to late 2000s, documentary or discussion of infernal affairs in Hong Kong cinema. So please check this out if you can. Hong Kong noir or Hong Kong film noir. And then that's not all, because then we have what's described as a making of 14-minute or so documentary short, which features Tony Leung and Andy Lau, and also Andrew Lau and Alan Mak, and others. This is a Media Asia. It's described as being Media Asia, and so I think we have seen it elsewhere, but it's also nice to have it part of the package here as well. And also included as another supplement, we have what's described as confidential file, and this is approximately 8 minutes. Again, more behind the scenes footage, actual shooting locations just prior to shooting, and certain scenes and the backstage stuff. And this is also something that we have seen in previous releases, but it's nice to have a certain carryover here. There's also an interesting little glimpse into a song being recorded, so that's also very interesting as well. Then there is a section in the supplements which is referred to as outtakes. This is totaling approximately 23 minutes. So it's raw footage, so you get that raw footage look, unprocessed look, or sort of a processed or pre-processed or processed look or non-processed look, whatever the case may be. Some of it's silent, some of it's not. I should point out that this is 23 minutes overall. We did see, for instance, I saw outtakes or deleted scenes or whatever one wants to call them on previous releases, although in previous releases those sections are shorter, so we're getting in this Criterion something that's totaling approximately 23 minutes overall. So it's great stuff. Again, more into the sense of how this film was shot and the way it's constructed together. It's great. And also you get a sense of I think there's a real lovely atmosphere on set that's reflected in outtakes like these. So it's well worth checking out if you have the opportunity. Approximately 23 minutes. And then last but not least, we have, rounding out this supplements for this Blu-ray disc, we have the trailers, the first of which being the original theatrical trailer, and then the second being what's referred to as supercut trailer. And this is with Janus Films, and I think the supercut trailer refers to the trailer promoting the trilogy overall. And so you get that as well. So you have the choice of watching these two trailers here as part of the supplements for the first Blu-ray disc for Infernal Affairs. In conclusion, or just to round out the conversation, I should point out the booklet, which is part of this package overall, this set overall. It does have brief breakdowns of each of the films. So Infernal Affairs is given its own little brief breakdown here, including its cast and crew listing here, as well as some pictures that I think are very significant to that film. But this is a booklet that is comprehensive to the set overall. So in addition to these breakdowns, so there are these brief breakdowns for each of the films, such as Infernal Affairs, but then accompanying that, we have a comprehensive essay. So let's talk about this comprehensive essay when we talk about this set as a whole, a wrap-up video a little bit later in this video discussion series. But just note that we do have it's on page 5, a sort of written description of Infernal Affairs, as well as the cast and credits that accompany the following pages. So it's worth checking out. It's worth checking out if you have the opportunity. It's certainly great. And again, we'll talk about this great booklet when we get to the video discussions a little bit later down the line. It's a really great booklet, by the way, and it's a really great essay. But that's it as far as this Disc 1 is concerned for this set. Infernal Affairs trilogy, and specifically this film, which is Infernal Affairs. It's a wonderful film in a wonderful collection, and for those who may be watching it or considering watching it for the first time, I know you're in for one heck of a ride indeed. Infernal Affairs. All right, my dear friends, so that's it for now, and so until we meet again, please be happy and healthy and well, and please keep on watching a lot of great, great, great movies. So thank you so much, as always, for your time. I very, very much appreciate it. Stay strong, stay safe, and cheers.